So, without further ado, Helen Campbell. Please go
Hi,
ahead.
thank you very much, Andrew. Thank you for inviting me. Well, you love applauding people here, don't you? I've noticed that, but I'm not used to it. We don't applaud much in Europe, but it's very nice of you to applaud, and you can do so. By the way, I'm also, I'm not just British, as you can hear from my accent, but born and brought up near London, after which I departed to the great continent. My father is a Canadian, was a Canadian, I'm afraid he's no longer with us, born in Toronto. So I do have credentials to be here as well, even if I haven't picked up my father's accent. In my youth, my school friends used to ask Daddy to say bottle of beer, because they loved when he said bottle of beer, and this was very considered terribly exotic, of course. You know, that's what it was then. Anyway. So I'm going to say a few words about conference interpreting because that's what I've done. I'll make it as rapid as possible. If I see people looking bored, I will cut it short, okay? I'll look at you all the time. If I see people doing this, I'm going to cut it right off. I don't want to bore you at all. But here we are. This is my field, conference interpreting. There are lots of different sorts of interpreting. There's public service, what we call in the UK public service interpreting. That's working in courts of law, and in hospitals, and for torture victims, and all sorts of different areas. But this is my bailiwick. This is where I came from. This is me, very briefly, my background. I went to school in London. I went to university in the 1960s. We're going back a very long way. I did not come across the Beatles personally, but that was the background of my time at university. I became a disc jockey. It was my first job after graduating, in this beautiful city of Freiburg im Breisgau in Germany. Very good job to have if you're thinking of doing interpreting later, because you work in the microphone, you hear your own voice, in other words, and you also, I had to do lots of translation as well. I was the voiceover for English and American pop songs, and I voiced over in German, so I translated the stuff into German and then gave the voiceover. Then I became a translator in Frankfurt am Main, and with German and English, both ways. And then we're now moving up to the 1970s, when the EU enlarged to include my country, the UK, and Ireland and Denmark. And there were not enough interpreters, conference interpreters, with those languages, and with the original 4 languages of the EU. So they started an in-house training program, and I was one of the first beneficiaries of that. So I learned, trained by other conference interpreters, actually in the European institutions. And I was working in booths, not quite as smart as that one in those days, but that is, roughly speaking, what I did. The European Union, you probably know what it is, but I'm just mentioning that it has 27 member states, and that is what it's all about. We have one currency for some of those member states. Free movement of goods, persons. It does make a big difference to people. You can go happily from one country to another if you have EU citizenship, nationality, and work in any of them. At the moment, this would be difficult because unemployment is pretty high everywhere, actually. Possibly less so in my own country than in some places. So those are the areas that we are focusing on there. Different jobs for language people in the EU. We have translators, editors, lawyer linguists. Those are normally people who will have studied law and have very solid knowledge of a couple of languages. Web editors, that's becoming more and more important now, as we know, and conference interpreters. So you can be a freelance interpreter, like many of my friends, and they will work in all sorts of different areas. I became an official, so I sat what's called an open competition. The same thing exists to join the United Nations. And I work for one of those 3, the European Commission, that's the one in the middle, that's the executive of the European Union. If you join us, you have to sit an exam, as for the UN. Once you pass that exam, you are eligible to work for the European Court of Justice, Parliament, and the European Commission. So I won't bore you with the details. If you're interested in how the EU works, have a look. There are translation services for all the different bodies, and that's a very large number of translators that we employ already. Just in the European Commission, only the Commission, forget the others, there are 2,000 of them. 2,000 staff translators, plus hundreds of thousands who are freelance translators, usually in agencies. This means a lot of work as well. For the interpreters, of course, fewer, but still, we have an interpreting service in the Commission, and another one in the Parliament, and another one in the Court of Justice. But it's one single exam you do for all three, which is helpful. I'm sure you all know the difference between the two professions, but I'm just reminding us all that interpreters communicate orally and translators write. And in the EU and in the UN, they are completely separate, though I have many friends who are interpreters and they also translate. I mean, it's very often for financial reasons. If they're freelancers and they're maybe not getting enough work at the beginning, they will also work as translators. So quite a lot do that, especially on the private market. Those are the languages. Everyone gasps when they see this sort of thing in action. The UN has 6 languages. We have 23 in the EU. They're not used all the time in all meetings, but that is the official number of our languages. And so anybody who wants to join our staff, sitting the open competition, has to be of one of those nationalities. If you want to be a freelance, and you sit our freelance accreditation test, you can be of any nationality. And we use lots of other non-EU languages. That's my former employer then, just the interpreting section of the European Commission. 850 staff. There are around, probably more than that now, about 600 staff interpreters, people like me who interpret into their mother tongue with 2 languages from the EU. That's the usual thing. So English, in my case, French, German and Italian. 2 is the minimum. 2 languages as well as your mother tongue, I'm saying. We mostly interpret into our mother tongues. And that's a whole lot of people. So 60 meetings every day, 800 interpreters will be working about that number anyway on any given day. And in case you're wondering about non-EU languages, for example, Chinese, we employ quite a lot of Chinese interpreters as well because we have Chinese visitors coming. We also actually do a training program in-house as well for Chinese. So if you're on our list and you've passed our test and we need you, and you live in Brussels, I might add, or close by, we will also employ freelancers, of course, with every language, with Russian, with Chinese, with Arabic, and all sorts, when we need them. We don't need that. The aptitudes of a conference interpreter. I put Nicole up there because if anybody's seen the film The Interpreter, you're nodding, good, yeah. She does portray things rather well. I think she shows, it's not a silly film, at least the bit of interpreting that we see her do. She was well trained by the chief interpreter of the United Nations. You need to have, for my purposes, interpreting into my mother tongue only. The thing that counts most is how I speak English. If you're listening to me interpret, you're listening to English. I have to have a very, very good knowledge of my foreign languages, what we call C languages. That's to say, I have to have a very solid knowledge indeed, understand everything in German, French and Italian. My Chinese colleagues in the UN and elsewhere will be working into Chinese from, say, English or another language, and then the other way around as well. So they will have to have 2 almost mother tongues. Come in, you're welcome. The same applies to several others, but that's a good example, I think, for the Chinese. Good general knowledge. We very much insist on that. You have to read the papers and know what's going on, because when you're interpreting subjects. You're interpreting finance, economics, the crisis, the Eurozone crisis, and so on. So we always stress to the students, read the papers, know what's going on. You have to analyze, not just repeat words, analyze what everybody is saying, and then you have to communicate the message. And I've added stress resistance because it sometimes is fairly stressful. So those are the things you need. These are the things people think you need. You do not have to have studied languages. My Director-General, former Director-General, is an Italian chemist who happens to have a very good knowledge of 3 languages, but he studied chemistry. What you do need is a university degree. That's essential. You won't get into the EU or the UN without it. But on top of that, you have to learn how to interpret, of course. But you can be like me, one language, English, and passive knowledge of those three. You don't have to be bilingual. Nice if you are, but we don't look for that. And then people told me, oh, my teachers at school told me I have to be a genius to be a conference interpreter. No, otherwise I wouldn't be in there. So that's wrong as well. The most important, the biggest need at the moment, as I speak, in both the United Nations and in the EU institutions is English mother tongue. We're not finding people. They are not being trained as interpreters, and the English speakers are not learning enough languages. And if you think about the language training here, and I think about it in the UK, I'm not surprised. The UK, you don't even have to do a language after a certain age, and nobody cares very much. So unless you're keen and good at it, which I was, you're not going to bother with languages. So we're short. I hope that's good news for all of you. You're looking interested there. Good. Another thing is who teaches interpreting. Only interpreters can teach interpreting. If there are also trainers like me, it's a great help. But you cannot teach it if you're, say, a literature professor. Interpreting, you have to know how to do it to teach anybody else. And you start off with stretching your memory and learning how to concentrate in a typical course. Then you learn a note-taking system to help you to do what we call consecutive interpreting, i.e. I speak and then you're scribbling your notes that you've learned how to do. Then you stand up and say the whole thing in French or whatever her language might be. That's consecutive. And the last step is into the booth, simultaneous. This is a bit of light relief. Here's the stereotype translator according to a piece of research done, serious research. Introvert, pedantic, interested in languages, all these things. Given to self-doubt. Translator friends get very upset now. Don't worry, it will come out in the wash in a minute. And here is the interpreter. Jack of all trades, superficial. We don't come out of this too well either, do we? Likes variety. This is the good bit now, where you guys, the translators, turn out to be, according to this research, more intelligent than the interpreters. Whereupon my interpreter friends say, just a minute, there's something wrong with that. Okay. We might be able to predict career paths on the basis of stereotype personalities. I know some quite extrovert translators. Not many, but I know some. The life and soul of the party. And I know one or two quite reserved interpreters. They are the minority, but they do exist. If you're thinking, or you know anybody else who might be thinking about how to get into the EU, where you go, that is your website. That is the European Union staffing person, what is it? I can't remember, staffing office anyway. They run the competitions. And the competition is the way you open competition, as with the UN, you sit in open competition. I'm sure you know that. But if you're interested, have a look at Europa and EPSO, and it tells you just what you need to get in. It's quite a lengthy process, quite long, yes. What about qualifications to work as a conference interpreter now? UN and EU. A degree. It can be in microbiology or mathematics or you name it. Training. Here we need the training. You must have completed training in conference interpreting. I underline that because that's what we recruit. So you may think, oh, I can do that. I know lots of languages, but you have to have a bit of paper that proves you've done, for example, Andrew will be telling you about the new interpreting course here. Then at least you can apply for a post or for a freelance test. Speak your mother tongue and the languages into which you interpret clearly and fluently, and whatever the language regulations are when you apply, you will look all that up. This is a typical interpreter's week, at least in the EU and probably in any other international organization. You might be interpreting in a meeting about finance. Everybody is at the moment. There's a lot of stuff on finance. You might be in a press conference next day. You might have an in-house teaching program. We do have some in the EU as well. So you might, if you want to teach and you have a qualification, you can, instead of just interpreting every day, you might be teaching as well. This is what happened to me regularly. Take the evening train, the Eurostar to London, and then work in London for a day in agency which deals with medicines, so my subject is medicine for that day. Return to Brussels, and then we organise language courses for our staff as well. So you might want to sign up to learn Czech or Hungarian or Latvian or something, and then you will be able to follow a course that they organise for the staff. That's another advantage. And then you go off to take the plane, which we were always doing all my life of travelling. It was a lot. And you might fly off to whichever country has the presidency of the EU. It's the Polish one. You might be in Warsaw for a meeting, and you might then come back next day or stay on for a day and visit. Just a few pictures. That's careers events that I'm attending. These are some colleagues of mine from the United Nations, translation. A translator in the European Commission, a translator in WTO, just to show we have a human face too, and they're all wearing grey suits, sorry about that. And a group of student interpreters visiting the European Parliament so that they can come and see what the realities will be when they finally come and work for us. Study visits of a couple of days at around there. And this is where I have been now. Up a mountain in a cable car was my first assignment. I have to add to you that I actually do not like heights at all, and that when the commissioner it was, who then afterwards became, by the way, President of Ireland, was visiting Augsburg, I was one of the interpreters, and he was given, please come along, Commissioner, we'd like to take you on the cable car and show you the beautiful countryside around. That's what happens when dignitaries visit, right? They were going to speak German, so who has to go with him? Me. Go on, move quick, the interpreter has to be there fast, right? You stand beside your commissioner, and you accompany him for the rest of the afternoon. I'm saying, well, I don't like, you don't think I have any choice. I'm in the cable car with him. I hate these things. I hate these things. But I was much more, I was very new, I'd only worked for 3 months. That my fear was not nearly so much of the height as of getting it wrong or not whispering. I was whispering to the commissioner. Now, such a nice man, Joel. Thank you so much. You're doing a great job. Lovely man. So I was very uplifted by him and his praise, or appreciation, not praise, appreciation, and lost my fear of cable cars. You might be in number 10 Downing Street. Indeed, there is an interpreter sitting beside two former important persons who are now, of course, totally forgotten. The one on the right, Mr. Sarkozy, I'm sure you recognise, and Gordon Brown. And here is Pavel, I forget this man's name. He always accompanies Gorbachev everywhere, still, 30 years later. So that's the interpreter in action. And some more interpreters in action, and some more pictures just to show you what an interpreter's reality is, daily bread. The interpreter is taking notes, I told you, consecutively up there, and will relay the message between the two in their respective languages, because that interpreter masters 2 languages. Excellent. Here we have Mr. Sarkozy's interpreter, who will be whispering in French, I suppose, to him. This was Copenhagen Climate Change Summit. And then she will be taking notes and delivering her message in English to Obama and Gordon Brown and everybody else who understands English. And I suppose there would be a German interpreter off the picture whispering to Mrs. Merkel. That's how it works when they're in closed circles like that. There they are. That's just normal reality. I just like the way these two are looking down at this woman up there. We can imagine that she might be an interpreter, and Mr. Berlusconi and Mr. Sarkozy are showing appreciation, whilst Mr. Obama is looking completely in the other direction. Places where I have been: the United Nations, St. Petersburg. I was training in St. Petersburg. Number 10, that's John Major. He was in there when I went. So you accompany people, you're escorted, you're standing beside them or sitting beside them and interpreting all over the place, not just in a booth. A few addresses for you. Just take one if you like, if you're interested, and you will link to everything else. For example, on Facebook, Interpreting for Europe, or the YouTube, there's some really good clips of interpreters, young interpreters, much younger than me, just saying why they're interpreting, how they got there, what they think the job's like. And they're really quite lively and quick to look at. Curia, the last one, is the European Court of Justice email. If you just get as far as that, you'll get links to everything else. That rounds me off. Thank you very much for listening. If you're interested, we'd be delighted. And don't forget what I said, we really do need people as well.
All right, so what we figured we would do at this point is just turn over the floor for maybe 2 or 3 specific questions about something that Helen might have said, and then we'll move on and we'll have a general question period when all 3 speakers are done. So, Helen, can I ask you maybe to take a couple of questions and I'll get myself hooked up and ready to go to the next one. So who has a question for Helen?
Don't worry if you don't. You might not even think of the questions until the end. But I'm not going to be here all evening, okay?
Captain, speak, go ahead.
So you said that you can't be an official unless you're a European Union citizen, right?
That's right.
Would you know which country is the easiest to become a citizen of?
Belgium. Well, I tell you what, a Brazilian friend of mine who's an interpreter too, he came, he was recruited. In those days, we recruited for Portuguese 2 altogether Brazilians because we couldn't find enough. I mean, that doesn't happen anymore. And he decided he wanted to have some EU nationality. Of course, he was in Brussels, so he was quite happy just to sit it out. But he got it 7 years. I think the UK would be the worst, probably. I don't know. It depends on your credentials. I was thinking of becoming a Canadian citizen because I've got a Canadian father. But I think it's quite difficult now anyway, isn't it, as well? Probably for me too. But at a guess, maybe Latvia might be quite easy as well. But if you have to learn the language, do you know French?
Yes.
Then you're halfway there for Belgium and France. Any other questions? You've got her sorted out now, anyway.
No.
Yes.
Is it really obligatory to have 3 languages to work in
It depends which languages. For example, when at the very beginning, when the Portuguese joined, they only needed to have 1 for about a year. As we then recruited enough Portuguese staff, the requirement immediately went up to two passive languages into a mother tongue. So if it's right at the beginning and we can't find enough people for Maltese, we will allow only 1, but we will expect Maltese English, English Maltese. Now we're pushing it up to 2. It's really supply and demand. 2 is for the English language. Would you be asking?
English or French?
English or French. For both of those 2, you'll need 2. And actually, you would have to have 2 additional languages to your
2 passive.
Yes. And I have to say, if you look up the requirements, they change all the time. I suspect that you need to have German is what we're pushing very hard. So if you wanted to work for us and you have an English mother tongue and a very strong French B, that's already very good. But you need 1 more. And if it happened to be German, you'd be recruited tomorrow. As long as you pass the test. As long as you pass the test. But we would love to have you with German. But I know it's quite difficult to sort of pick up. Do you have another one? Do you have Spanish, for example? Yeah. And if you work both ways, into French and into English, that's still quite rare for us. So you have a head start on that. If you need the other. Just get all the Spanish you get.
Okay, maybe one more question for Helen and then we'll change gears.
Oh, well, no, right, then those 2 and then that's it. Right.
So for Chinese, for example, Cantonese and Mandarin, does it count as just 1 language, or is it
Mandarin.
2?
Mandarin.
Just Mandarin, not Cantonese.
I mean, I suppose if we have a meeting and it's a delegation with Cantonese, we will recruit someone with Cantonese. But as it's not, I mean, this will be on the basis of freelance recruitment.
Right.
So we will take whatever it is we require, we will be looking for that. But mostly, shall I say, mostly it's Mandarin.
We'll also need like Spanish or French or German.
No, not as a freelance, not as a freelance. If you're recruited for because we've got this huge Cantonese delegation coming to talk to the president of the commission, we will require English and Cantonese.
Right.
So if you can do both and you've passed our test, we will recruit you for that day when you come.
Right. Also, there needs to be a EU citizen.
No, you're not for a freelance.
Not for
I
freelance.
repeat, freelancers, you can be any nationality.
Right.
Staff going through all those complicated open competitions, that's only for the EU. For the United Nations, Chinese is an official language, so of course you're open to both freelance and staff.
Okay. Good, thank you.
And one more. Thank
That's
you.
my question as well.
Oh, okay, got it. That was convenient. Thank you very much.